Where American Conservation Was Forged by Robbie Lopp. When Theodore Roosevelt first arrived in Dakota Territory in 1883, he did not come as a conservationist. He came as a hunter. At 24, he was already a rising political figure in New York, restless and ambitious. The Northern Pacific Railway had opened the Badlands to Eastern investors, and Roosevelt, drawn by both adventure and opportunity, traveled west to hunt bison. What he encountered instead was something far more consequential, a landscape that he would fundamentally reshape his understanding of power, responsibility, and the limits of abundance. Roosevelt would later write, "I would never have been president if it had not been for my experiences in North Dakota." That statement is often quoted. It deserves to be taken literally. The hard lessons of the open range. The Badlands of the 1880s were not a postcard wilderness. They were volatile, wind-carved, economically unstable, and ecologically fragile. Roosevelt invested in the Maltese Cross Ranch and, after the deaths of his wife and mother on the same day in February 1884, returned west to immerse himself in the ranching life. He later established the Elkhorn Ranch along the Little Missouri River. Out there, he rode alongside cowboys, tracked thieves, managed cattle, and endured brutal winters. He also witnessed firsthand the environmental consequences of unchecked expansion. The cattle boom of the mid-1880s had drawn speculators eager to profit from open-range grazing. Grasslands were overstocked. Few understood the carrying capacity of the land. When the catastrophic winter of 1886 and 87 struck, bringing deep snow, sudden thaws, and plunging temperatures, the weakened herds perished by the thousands. The open-range system collapsed. Roosevelt absorbed the lesson. The West was vast, but it was not inexhaustible. Land abused would not endlessly replenish itself. Wildlife overhunted would not automatically rebound. The mythology of limitless American expansion collided with ecological reality on the frozen plains of Dakota. This experience did not make Roosevelt anti-growth or anti-development. It made him skeptical of waste and deeply aware of stewardship. From naturalist to conservation leader, Roosevelt had loved nature long before he set foot in Dakota. As a boy in New York City, often confined indoors by severe asthma, he obsessively studied birds and animals, creating what he proudly called his Roosevelt Museum of Natural History. He read voraciously, cataloged specimens, and trained himself as a serious amateur naturalist. But intellectual fascination is different from lived experience. In the Badlands, he saw ecosystems under strain. He experienced drought cycles, grass depletion, river fluctuations, and the fragility of wildlife populations. He saw how market forces could push land past its limits. Years later, when he entered the White House, those memories shaped policy. As president, Roosevelt protected approximately 230 million acres of public land. He established 150 national forests, 51 federal bird reserves, 4 national game preserves, 5 national parks, and 18 national monuments under the 1906 Antiquities Act. He created the United States Forest Service and elevated conservation to a national priority. His conservation philosophy was neither preservationist in the absolute sense nor laissez-faire exploitation. It rested on a principle of responsible use. Natural resources were to be used wisely, scientifically managed, and preserved for future generations. In a 1907 message to Congress, Roosevelt wrote, "The conservation of natural resources is the fundamental problem. Unless we solve that problem, it will avail us little to solve all others." The seeds of that conviction were planted in Dakota soil. Conservation as civic duty. What is striking about Roosevelt's conservation legacy is how closely he tied it to citizenship. He did not frame conservation solely as environmental protection. He framed it as a moral obligation of self-government. In his worldview, a democratic republic required citizens capable of thinking beyond immediate gain. Stewardship of forests, water, and wildlife was a test of national character. Roosevelt believed Americans held the land in trust, not only for themselves, but for generations yet unborn. That idea, now foundational to environmental policy, was radical in an era defined by rapid industrial expansion. The Badlands had shown him something essential. If individuals pursued only short-term profit, the common good suffered. Conservation became, in his mind, an extension of civic responsibility. It is not accidental that the same president who advanced trust-busting and regulatory reform also expanded federal protection of natural landscapes. In both cases, Roosevelt sought to balance individual enterprise with collective responsibility. The Badlands as crucible. Standing today along the Little Missouri River, it is possible to see why the landscape left such an imprint on him. The Badlands are beautiful, but not indulgent. They demand attentiveness. Weather changes quickly. Distances deceive. Grasslands that appear resilient can erode under pressure. Life persists, but only in balance. Roosevelt arrived as a young man seeking adventure. He left with a philosophy forged in experience. That strength without restraint leads to depletion. That leadership requires foresight. And that national greatness depends, in part, on how we treat the land beneath our feet. North Dakota did not simply heal him after personal tragedy, it molded him. Why it still matters. Today, debates over public lands, resource extraction, wildlife management, and environmental resilience continue to test our ability to think long-term. Roosevelt's model does not provide easy answers to modern complexities, but it does offer a framework. He believed in science-informed policy. He believed in federal leadership when national interests were at stake. And he believed conservation was not a partisan cause, but a patriotic one. His experiences in the Badlands remind us that conservation policy is rarely abstract. It emerges from lived encounters with the land, economy, and community. Roosevelt's conservation legacy was not born in a committee room. It was forged on horseback, in blizzards, amid failed cattle ventures and fragile prairie grass. Theodore Roosevelt National Park now preserves part of that landscape. The Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library, currently under construction in Medora, stands within sight of it, a reminder that the story of American conservation did not begin in Washington, but in the West. In keeping with that legacy, the library has launched on-the-ground conservation initiatives in the Badlands, including a large-scale native prairie restoration effort using locally sourced seeds to rebuild biodiversity on degraded grasslands. The project emphasizes ecological resilience, long-term stewardship, and scientific partnership, principles Roosevelt himself championed. It is a modest but tangible way to ensure that conservation remains not just a chapter in history, but a lived practice. Looking ahead, the institution is also developing a TR Conservation Scholars Program to support emerging leaders working in the intersection of land stewardship, public policy, and civic responsibility. Plans are underway for a reoccurring Conservation Summit in Medora, envisioned as a national forum for serious, cross-partisan dialogue on conservation. Much as the Reagan Defense Forum has become a convening space for national security at the Ronald Reagan Library, the aim is not ceremony, but substance, a place where conservation policy and civic leadership met in the landscape that shaped Roosevelt's thinking. If we want to understand Roosevelt's conservation achievements, we must not look first to the White House, but to the Badlands. That is where the transformation began.